Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition of FedScoop's Government Technology Webinar Series, sponsored today by NetApp. And I'm your host, Wyatt Cash, Vice President of Content Strategy for FedScoop and Scoop News Group. And today we're going to take a look at the topic of migrating data more reliably to the cloud. Joining us today are a couple of veteran government IT leaders and experts who've tackled some of these issues firsthand and have kindly agreed to share some of the key lessons that they've learned. So first, I'm pleased to welcome Lisa Hearns. Lisa is the acting Deputy Director, Office of Technology Operations and Planning at the Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today.
Great. Also joining us today is Mike Dye. Mike is the Chief Technology Officer for civilian agencies and for the public sector at NetApp. Mike, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Wyatt. Very happy to be here.
And we also are pleased to have Kevin Baker with us. Kevin is the Associate CIO for Enterprise Planning and Performance at the Federal Communications Commission. Welcome to the program, Kevin.
Thanks a lot, Wyatt. I'm glad to be here.
And I also want to welcome our audience, both those that are joining us live today as well as those tuning into the archived on-demand edition of this program. And once again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank NetApp for sponsoring today's program. Before we begin, just a quick couple of things to help our audience get familiar with our console and how they can participate today. First, at the bottom of the screen of your console, if you will, there are a few application widgets that you can use. If you have any questions for our presenters, and we encourage you to ask them during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question, and we will try to answer as many of those during the live webcast as we can, either during the presentations or towards the end of the program. Also, a copy of today's slide deck will be available. If you look at the far right of the collection of widgets, you'll see something called the resource list. It looks kind of like a folder at the bottom of your screen, and you can download a PDF version of all of the slides today. And you can also expand your slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top of the slide area or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area so it fits your screen. And lastly, if you have any technical difficulties, you can just click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers some common technical issues. But for the most part, it should be a pretty clean presentation today. And then finally, there is and will be a on-demand version of the webcast today. It will be available approximately a day after today's webcast for about 90 days, and it can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. So if you have colleagues who might benefit from today's presentation, please share the link with them and share some of the lessons that our guests have been kind enough to present today. So with that, let's get started. So Lisa, you've been involved in a number of cloud projects and ways your organization works with the cloud and has had a number of experiences. Tell us a little bit more about your experience at the EPA and maybe some of the biggest takeaways that you've learned.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to share with you EPA's experience as it comes to migrating the data to the cloud. The first major initiative we made of moving a big system to the cloud was actually in moving our email to the cloud. So in February of 2013, EPA became the first federal agency to move email calendar contents to the Microsoft Office government community cloud. There were a few agencies that have moved portions of their email there and some that have had dedicated instances of Office 365. But we were the first to sort of dive in the deep end of their government community cloud. In that process, there were a number of steps you go through. So our plan A was to move all of our data over, all of our calendar content, resources, et cetera, over a 6-week period. We were going to stagger it over 6 weekends, literally dividing the workforce in 6 and moving them over a piece at a time. We spent an extensive amount of time and effort in preparing for our user community for this transition, preparing our data for the migration, making sure it was in an appropriate shape for migration. We increased our bandwidth in order to move that volume of data over. We tested the coexistence, since we would be coexisting between our existing system and the new system, our on-premise notes and our cloud-based Office 365. We tested that extensively. We tested the migration tool for the integrity of it to make sure there was no spoliation of the data as it transferred over. And then we tested finally that migration of the tool for throughput to make sure that we could get it through the tool set in the time allotted. And it's on that one that it actually failed. We found that that migration was going to take us almost a year to move the volume of data that we wanted to move over. And so then, of course, you go to plan B at that point. We looked at a variety of tools in order to try to figure that out. And although we did select another tool to do the migration for us, we reduced some of the time, we still realized we would never be able to move all of it in a reasonable amount of time. And coexistence between an on-premise Lotus Notes and a cloud-based Office 365 was just going to be too difficult. So we planned on copying just 30 days worth of our mail, calendar, and contacts over, and we decided to do it over one weekend, or at least do the official migration of users over one weekend, which was President's Day in 2013. We actually performed in the background 2 data migrations prior to that on evenings and weekends, moved about 12 terabytes worth of data over well before the President's Day weekend. And on that President's Day weekend, we moved just the last 3 terabytes worth of data over. And with that, we migrated over the 20,000 end users and about 5,000 BlackBerries that we moved at that time. So it was a great success, and we're glad that we've done it, and we're glad that we're there. But looking back, there's a couple of lessons learned, and a few of them I wanted to mention here. Some things to sort of not to underestimate, because, of course, we fell into some of these traps. Some we did not, but to share with you. First of all, obviously, bandwidth needs are critical for the migration. Obviously, we had planned for that, but also the bandwidth needs going on. Now that our mail is in the cloud, all those transactions we had done on our local area network are now across our internet connection. So although we increase bandwidth last year and we're increasing bandwidth this year, we're going to be doing the same next year because people are starting to use it more and use more of the features such as the Skype for Business video conferencing, and because we're moving more applications to the cloud. So there's that whole piece that we have to build into the cost equation. And that relates to the next bullet I have here, which is the on-premise infrastructure, to make sure you don't underestimate that as well. There was a significant investment in ADFS that we implemented at this time that we had not expected in this migration. There are other impacts on other systems and processes that we have here. E-discovery and FOIA, a large part of what our agency does. As the Environmental Protection Agency, every time you see anything going on in the environment in the press, you can probably guarantee that I'm going to get a FOIA about that or a discovery request about that. The tool we had to do e-discovery had promises of being able to work on cloud resources. It did not. It would time out consistently. So we have had to come up with a different solution to do e-discovery and FOIA. Records management. Again, we had an on-premise system to help us do records management. That has been a bit more of a challenge than we had anticipated in making sure we tie it in there. We have pass forwards on both of these areas that we're working on now, but there was a significant impact there. And there's also impact on staffing. I think all of us know when you're doing something like moving email to a new platform, regardless of where it is, cloud or otherwise, there's a customer impact here. But the impact on our staff was significant. Our security professionals are particularly having a hard time with the lack of visibility and control over the environment that they were used to when it was on-premise. So it's been an adjustment for them and our IT professional staff as well. There's a new set of skills that they've had to learn in managing a cloud service, a new way of thinking about things. They're very much used to being able to go into our computer center and, in a sense, kick the box, right? Reboot the system, plan when upgrades would happen, plan when patching would happen, plan when new things were rolled out to our customers. That control is taken out of our hands at this point. And that's been a significant change for our IT professional staff. One thing I want to mention is the overall cost of moving and living in the cloud does not necessarily mean that cloud is a cost saver. There are a lot of reasons you may want to move to the cloud about reliability, availability, et cetera, but think carefully about whether or not you're jumping there just because you think it's going to save you money. It does not necessarily save the bottom line. And then, as with any project, the last thing here is that there are always simple things that are going to cause problems. There's always going to be the unexpected, and prepare for that, and this is true of any project you implement. There were little things like hyphen names and apostrophes that Link couldn't handle, which Outlook could, that repeating meetings that got transferred over not as a series but as individual meetings. So those sort of little hiccups along the way that made for, shall we say, an interesting challenge as we deployed this solution. So where's the agency going from here as we move forward? Right now we're working on, we have a significant investment in Lotus Notes applications. So we're looking at deleting, archiving, and or transitioning those onto other platforms. We have about 25,000 applications out there. We expect in our process that 80% of those will either be deleted or archived, and about the other roughly 3,000 to 4,000 we're looking at consolidating to make sure we don't have duplicative applications for our different bureau offices and streamlining them. And in the end, probably about 2,000 applications will then be redesigned and re-implemented on other platforms, primarily SharePoint Online, but potentially other platforms as well. And as I mentioned before, we've left our Lotus Notes mail intact. It's an archive for our employees right now. We're going to be moving that data now finally into the Outlook archive, and that's going to be able to help us eliminate the cost of maintaining all those Lotus Notes servers in my environment, and also ease the e-discovery and FOIA issues that I mentioned before. We'll be able to use the same tool that we're using to search our current Outlook mailboxes to be able to search our archive email, and it's going to help us address our records management issues. On another front, for other systems, what we're looking at is implementing a multi-year cloud strategy that's going to really transform the way we do IT services for the agency. Right now, we run the National Computer Center for our agency. We are the hosting provider of servers for our agency systems. We're moving towards a couple things, getting skilled at being the cloud broker. So system owners will come to us and we'll assess their systems to determine their readiness for the cloud and determine whether or not they're better to be on an on-premise private cloud capability that we would be managing, whether it should be in a third-party cloud service provider on contracts we manage, or some hybrid between the two of those. And the idea is that we would be able to broker that for them, having expertise about what is right for each system and making sure we get the right solution for each of those systems. So that's kind of a quick summary, thumbnail about what's going on at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm open for any questions that you might have.
Terrific. Thank you, Lisa. And again, I invite our audience to use your Q&A chat function to submit some questions. I have one quick one for you. You mentioned that the IT staff and their security team needed a new set of skills as you move to the cloud. What type of training would you recommend that other agencies plan for with their current or evolving staff?
So some of this is sort of a different sort of contract management skills, because this is a different kind of a contract. They're used to more a contract where you deal with individuals. This is one with stronger SLAs, stronger management controls on the cloud. So a little bit on contract management, and a little bit on a lot of it is about changing the way you're thinking about doing things. And that's not necessarily a training as much as like a classroom to go to, as much as just a different way of thinking about how you manage that contract, how you manage that service, because it's not managing a box, you're managing a service here, and it's a different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and as we often hear, it's as much about change management as the technology management part of that. So,
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Well, Mike, I'd like to get your perspective now. You kind of get a broad view of a lot of cloud applications and services that are working in the federal government space. Tell us what you're seeing and some of the things that you might recommend to our audience.
Well, as you and your audience might suspect, being at NetApp, we look at the cloud changes from the lens of data and data management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges of implementing a hybrid cloud environment and what we do to address some of those issues. As you try and move forward with a cloud implementation, we all understand the benefits of it. As Lisa mentioned, you're not necessarily going to save money moving to the cloud, but you're going to be able to adapt and respond more dynamically to changes and near-term projects that you have to turn on very quickly that you might not be able to procure equipment for. But you also have to be careful because you have these different places where cloud services can be provided, whether it's on-premise in your own private cloud, in a small to medium-sized cloud provider, or what we refer to as the hyperscale cloud providers. So a lot of people look at doing a hybrid implementation so that they can get the best of all of those worlds. But it can create a bit of a challenge to connect all of those things together and understand which data goes where and how you glue all of it together seamlessly. So the hybrid cloud also brings up some other interesting challenges from monitoring, managing, and addressing performance issues, availability, scalability, everything to data governance. Who owns the data when I have it reside in a cloud? And on top of all of that, data doesn't move easily because data is the one thing in all of our infrastructure that has weight to it. There is actually something there. When I turn on a new server, when I deploy a new server resource in the cloud, it's ready to go. It's waiting for me to do something. But when I want to get my data turned on, that actually has to move somewhere because we all want to look at pictures of our grandchildren, but we don't necessarily want to look at pictures of a grandchild. So we have a lot of information that we have to move, and that data is in specific formats. It's addressable as we want to look at it. So how do we move this data around seamlessly and without the troubles that Lisa mentioned in terms of the amount of data that had to be transferred and migrated? So what NetApp has done is created something we call the data fabric. And what the data fabric allows you to do is manage your data wherever you want to have it with all of the same tools that you're used to with your current implementation. So whether or not you want to have a private cloud, perhaps put together with one of our Flex pods and some cloud orchestration tools, although you could use any server infrastructure if you chose, to moving everything up to the cloud, one of the hyperscalers or one of the others, or whether or not you want to, and then, when you do the private storage, you're actually allowed to have your data adjacent to the cloud, not in the cloud, but right next door to it. Or perhaps if you want to keep your data in the cloud, actually turning on an instance of our OnTap operating system in the cloud and use all the tools that you know and love today. So let's look at all of those different environments. But it's important to understand that where NetApp comes from. We built our foundation for the cloud very early on, and we have the capability to create individual instances of what we call a storage virtual machine so that we can manage that one entity and all of the data associated with it. And it creates this virtual environment so I can have multi-tenancy with security and scalability. But these are very portable to the cloud because I can deploy one of these virtual machines in the cloud or attach one of them to a cloud instance. So let's talk about a private cloud instance. Let's say you want to put one together yourself. What would we be looking at for our tools? The first thing you need to do is have a good, solid storage foundation that has robust data services. And we put it together with a pre-validated data center platform so that you can have something akin to a cloud in a can. So you can deploy something that's been tested, validated, with all the tools associated with it, so you can start deploying your cloud instances where they need to go, when they need to go there. And all of these tools that I'm talking about at the top here all allow you to hit those 5 major points that everyone wants to see in a cloud instance. It's got to be flexible. It's got to be dynamic. It has to have a self-service mechanism associated with it, whether or not you push the buttons on that self-service mechanism or the community does it themselves. It's got to be something that can be adaptable. We tie all of these together with our data services so that you can choose, say, OpenStack or VMware or Microsoft, whatever tools you choose, and they're all deployable with the tools that you're used to using. So let's say you're using OpenStack, you could spin out a data block using Cinder. If you're using VMware or vRealize automation, you could use the vVol function of that and go in and understand what kind of storage needs to be deployed and put the right instance out there for the job at hand. And that allows you to create what I'm showing here, which is a service catalog. And from this service catalog, you can go in and choose the appropriate resources for the appropriate job, and you, as administrators, can put those together in the form that they need. So if it's a high performance, low latency database, you want to have the fastest storage available, whether that be flash or a mixture thereof, and you can associate those with those different items in the service catalog. All of this allows you to create what we call service level objectives, so that you can now go in and assign a type of performance metric and a type of service associated with the job at hand. So again, to use an example of a database, you want to have the fastest storage possible. But if you're building an archive or a SharePoint site, you kind of want that data to be robust and you want it to be able to live there, but you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of money on the storage associated with it. So you have the two opposite extremes, and things tend to fit in the middle based on what you need to do. But one of the things that you're troubled with, as we mentioned before, is migrating that data to the cloud. How do I get it from that private cloud up to the public cloud? One of the ways you could do this is by putting the data next to the cloud, or what we call adjacent to the cloud, with our NetApp private storage offering. What this allows you to do is purchase your own array with your own disks in it, put it into a data center that is right next door to the major cloud providers. They all offer a service by which they will extend a data link to these implementations, and you can get up to 10 gigabits per link into each of these different cloud providers. And now you own your own array. You have it setting in your cage inside a data center, and you can deploy it to whichever of the hyperscalers you want to. And this gives you the ability to be a smart shopper. If I am getting a better deal from Amazon today, I can go buy my compute from Amazon and use my own storage to address the compute that I deploy out in Amazon, or perhaps Microsoft, and be able to move seamlessly between them without too much trouble, because your data is already there. You don't have to copy it from the Microsoft Azure cloud over to Amazon. It's already in your own private storage, in your own cage, in that data center. All you really have to do is unmount it or disassociate it with one provider and associate it with another provider. This also may address some data governance or security requirements that you have, where you don't want your data to sit on storage that legally belongs to somebody else. The other thing you can do is start to copy your data over to this site through a DR policy. So we have a number of different products to do this. You can use SnapMirror, you can use Metro Cluster, whatever the case may be, so that in the event of a failure, I can take my on-premise data center by doing this DR replication to a near or adjacent to the cloud storage device, I can fail over with cloud resources and cloud compute resources when I have a problem. And I don't have to deploy a second data center. All I have to really do is have that array sitting in the Equinix data center adjacent to the cloud. I hope my dog's not too loud in the background. I told her to be quiet. Finally, NetApp also offers a cloud version of OnTap. So we will actually deploy with Amazon's EC2 capability an instance of our operating system with all of the products associated with it. So I can actually set up on-premise a relationship between my own array and an instance of OnTap in the cloud and do all of the things that I have listed here. I can provide data services through iSCSI, NFS, or CIFS. I can actually make snapshots locally. I can actually replicate from this cloud instance of OnTap over to my own on-premise array. All of the same features that I get with an on-premise array are offered with OnTap Cloud, with OnTap Cloud, and I can actually move my data as seamlessly as I need. Finally, we would want to manage these with a tool, and Cloud Manager is what you would use to tie these various data centers together that you've deployed. So if you've got a mixture of NetApp private storage, you've got your own on-premise private cloud, and you've got Cloud Manager, I can manage all three of those from one location, and that's what the Cloud Manager does. Designed to be drag and drop, allowing you to manage things as easily as possible and see what's going on in that environment. So, as this last slide here is designed to show, I can move my data with the same tools I'm used to today. I don't have to use any kind of migration tools. I just set up a relationship between the different instances and start moving my data accordingly. You could even conceivably, if you needed to migrate a large implementation to an adjacent cloud service, ship the array to one location, mirror the data, then move it out to its final destination, and you've pre-populated that array, and you can start your DR relationship instantaneously. But it's also important to think about how we back up our data. And we have a product called AltaVault that allows you to run your backups locally and cache that data locally, because we all know that most restorations occur with data that was fairly recently either accidentally deleted or something happened last week, and we need to get that data back. Usually 90% of restores happen within the last 30 days. So we keep what we call a cache on site of that most recently backed up information. But now we can actually move that data into the cloud over the S3 protocol so that I'm shipping my data off-site. Most of us ship our data off-site already today, but we're loading tapes into the back of a truck and sending it to a secure location. This allows you to move this information electronically and not have to wait for that truck to arrive to get your data off-site. If your off-site location happens to be another location for your own organization, you can actually deploy one of our storage grid devices that speaks the same language, which is known as S3, and you can actually archive this data to whatever location you see fit. And that's what I'm showing on this slide with our web scale storage grid appliance. This works with all of the major backup software today because it just presents a share that we can latch on to make the backups to as a target. And we will do deduplication and encryption so that your data actually is encrypted in flight to whatever cloud provider you are using. And I think you'll see from what I've shown here today that we have a very robust cloud offering. NetApp likes to say that we don't try and sell people their own private clouds only. We'll actually go with whatever cloud design you think is best for your organization and use all the tools that you know and love today and that'll make you much more productive and available to get to work immediately. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Mike, and I think you put into perspective a couple of interesting strategies, particularly dealing with large volumes of data, backing up data, and just some approaches, which I appreciate your sharing. And we are getting a couple questions from our audience, but before we take those, I'd like to give Kevin a chance just to chat a little bit about what he's doing, and again invite our audience to submit your questions via the chat tool. And then after Kevin's presentation, we'll start to take on some of those questions. So with that, Kevin, tell us a little about what you're doing over at the FCC.
Sure. Well, thanks, Wyatt. So these are some of my personal thoughts on not only what we're doing at the FCC, but this kind of business in general and some of the things that people may run across in their own organizations. So I've kind of taken this discussion back to a little bit of the softer side of how you deal with moving data, and really the impact on the customer is a huge piece of this. So one piece of advice is to definitely take a customer-centric approach. And, really, your customer has to have confidence in knowing where their data is stored and that it's safe and that it's secure and that it's available to them. And they don't need to know the specifics of what building it's in and what street address they can find it at. But really making sure that you have an active dialogue with customers so they know and understand what's going on. And second, making sure that you leverage your existing relationships with customers who are what I'll call friendly to IT. They're friends of your organization, your IT team. Those are going to be your champions, and they're going to help you tremendously in how you conduct testing and how you do dry runs and building your project plans and your schedules for doing this work. They provide a lot of valuable input, so don't overlook those people in your organization out on the customer edge to help come up with a better approach. If you have a CRM element who handles that high-level customer engagement, at the FCC, for example, we call them intrapreneurs. They're extremely important in this because they're visible, they're engaged, and they're completely informed from your side, which gives a lot of credibility to everything that you're doing when the customer looks at it. And you don't want the customer to run and hide from this. You want them to embrace it and be part of the effort. Big thing is you've got data across the organization, and you don't know where all of it is. I guarantee that. Work with the customer to find that stuff, that whether it's created by shadow IT or other elements of the organization that you may not be aware of, because if you look at doing a major migration, you're going to have not only the stuff that you know and plan for, but probably some other things that are hidden out there. Very important for you to track that stuff down up front. And then, of course, lastly, don't forget the security piece. Think about it up front. Plan, involve your security team. Just like we do everything else these days, security has to be baked in from the beginning. Same story here. Make sure the data is properly marked or classified. If you have PII or trade secrets or any of those especially sensitive things, make sure you've captured it right and your security team is on board. I'll stress one more thing is at the FCC, we are one of the first people to actually put data officers in our bureaus and offices. The idea behind that is making sure that we have folks who are knowledgeable in the areas where that data is created and analyzed and shared and all those things. So people's side of this is just as important as a good technical approach. And looking forward to that some of that stuff, you've got a one-size-does-not-fit-all kind of scenario. Your plans and tools need to fit the organization. Not everyone is the same. And what is the most critical items that you need to look at first? And those are going to be very tailored to what you and your organization do. It's important that making sure you let your vendors play an active part. And they have knowledge, they have experience, that they've seen more than you've seen. Let them be actively involved in helping you plan. They want to succeed just as much as you do. That's good for any relationship moving forward. And they have experts that you can get access to as part of your planning that's going to be incredibly valuable to making sure that you don't make a mistake that causes you to have to significantly change your approach once you're already down that road. Another thing is look for feedback from other clients. If you have a vendor that's proposing a particular approach, ask for feedback from other folks who have worked with that vendor and used that same approach just to get their experience. And they may not have a formal lessons learned kind of scenario, but they'll probably be glad to give you some comments. Remember that one single product or service probably won't do it. You're probably going to have a variety of tools out there, maybe from multiple vendors, may not. But that's going to be very dependent on your own organization's infrastructure, what products you have in place now, what your timelines are, and obviously the kinds of data that you're thinking about moving. We touched on this earlier, Lisa did, and that is the impact on the current staff. There's going to be some knowledge transfer here, and there are going to be some changes that occur, and it's important to understand what the impact is on your labor. You maybe have less system admin moving forward. You may have a whole new area of focus managing these services remotely that your team may need to learn and get trained up on before you go down that road. And lastly, take an incremental approach. The odds of you being able to shift your enterprise over the course of a couple of weekends is pretty unlikely. But you could do manageable pieces of it. And there's plenty of good examples out there. We heard from the EPA and some of the approaches that they've taken. It's not an overnight process, and if it's well planned, you can do phases that really complement not only what your organization has going on, but the amount of staffing and manpower and resources that you have to do all this work, because it's not going to be trivial. Okay. So one of the last areas that I want to touch on is what I've called the gotchas. And these are not hard and fast. Everybody's going to have these issues. But I can tell you from experience, these are things that you should consider and think about a little bit. We talked earlier about you may not save money moving to the cloud. Absolutely. This is not an exact science, and the outcomes are not exact. But make sure you understand how pricing works. If you go over a data threshold or you need additional computing resources, do you have the ability to manage that? Do you have resources? Do you have a contract that supports that sort of dynamism that has to happen within the organization? Another thing is look at making sure that your solution provider is FedRAMP certified and that you're looking at solutions that are not almost approved. We hear a lot about, well, we're almost there. We're just around the corner. You need to verify that. We don't want to get ourselves in a situation where we have knowingly done anything that violates the trust between the customer and us as IT as it relates to their data. Lastly, be patient with your contracting staff. This is new territory for them. They're used to commodity buys off the shelf. We're going to buy this hardware and this software, or we're going to buy these labor hours to do this work. It's not that simple anymore. Think of it as a monthly subscription. So take time to sit down with them and explain to them how we're not talking about annual maintenance fees anymore, or buying computers or buying servers and storage. It's really a new model for them, and take the time to spend with them and explain how it works and sort of chart that territory together. It'll be really helpful for you moving forward, because acquisition folks these days are not common. There are not enough of them out there to do the work that we needed them to do, and we can't do it without them. So partner with them and go on that journey together as it relates to going after a lot of these cloud service kind of capabilities. So that's all I had.
Well, great, Kevin. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the gotcha part there. I thought that was kind of interesting. And at this point, we're going to open it up to some of the questions from our audience. We have a few in the queue, and invite you all to submit some more. But one of the questions that has come up here, and I can maybe address this to Kevin and to Lisa. Both of you mentioned that those that felt you would save money going to the cloud may have underestimated some of the additional costs that factor in. I guess I'd ask each of you briefly, what was the one or two cost areas that maybe either surprised you or that you would suggest you really have to kind of keep an eye on that come along with migrating to the cloud compared to the old way of doing business? Lisa, maybe I'll start with you and double back with Kevin.
Yeah. So, and I sort of alluded to this a little bit in my conversation before. So, when we migrated to the cloud, there was a large infrastructure we had to build on-premise for mail processing within our infrastructure for ADFS, the AD Federation services. We ended up having to stand up 16 servers just to do ADFS for our agency. And that was well beyond anything we had anticipated. We thought we would, in our initial looks, thought we could have 2 to 4 of those servers, and they ended up having to, obviously, by a factor of 4, we were off on that one. So it was the whole infrastructure, servers, and staffing, and of course there's maintenance of those servers, right, that we had not appropriately accounted for.
Interesting. How about you, Kevin?
I would say underestimating the resources that you need and not realizing how much utilization the stuff is going to get or how much data is really going to live out there. The data volume that people are creating these days is incredible. And I think that the model we've used in the past to estimate what our storage needs would be next year and maybe the year after, you're going to find is probably not sufficient anymore. So you really need to do a good analysis up front, and then secondly, make sure that the contracts that you have in place support growth, and it's growth that you can handle from a resource perspective.
Great. So I have a question here from James in our audience, and this is directed at Lisa, and he wants to know, what are some of the key benefits you're seeing so far, given that EPA was really one of the early adopters and probably more mature in the process than some others? What are some of those key benefits that you're seeing and maybe even surprised you?
So it didn't really surprise us, but one of the key benefits that we wanted and have seen in this is the rapid rollout of new technology. In an on-premise world, it was always a very staggered process of rolling out the next release, the next new thing, right? In this case, add-on to Lotus Notes, new versions of Lotus Notes, whatever. And there was a whole vetting process that would have to go on internally within our agency to make sure that happened. Right or wrong, and the first couple times it took us by surprise, I'll tell you that much, the things get rolled out from Microsoft with not as much, without the ability for us to do testing internally. So it comes at us. Now they've done testing of it. So it's new things, new capabilities coming out and rolling out to our end users pretty quickly. That's actually made my internal system owners have to move their systems and their operations a little faster too because of that. But we've been able to roll out things much, much faster that way, and new capabilities are getting in the hands of our end users without a whole lot of bureaucracy internally within the agency that says, I just need to test it one more time. And that's been kind of nice to see.
Appreciate that. I have another question here from Jim, and he wanted to know, Lisa, what you feel are some of the new tools and applications and vendor services now, maybe including NetApp solutions, that address some of the issues you've encountered at EPA, that you're now having kind of a better visibility of what you might be able to use and work toward?
You know, in this field, in this area, there's tools that are constantly coming out. So we're, and so I'm not necessarily saying it's going to be the best tool or not, but we're looking at the Dell migration tool for moving our email to the rest of our email to the cloud. So there's a number of other tools. That's one of them, and that's the one we're probably leaning towards at this point. But there's 3 or 4 others that we've been looking at the process for doing that. But that space is constantly changing. E-discovery is another area that we were looking at tools, cloud-based tools for that. And when we started our looking at that 2 years ago, half the vendors have either been bought out or gone out of business, and another half as many have come onto the work. So it's hard to stay up on it all because it's such an evolving area.
Makes sense, and I'm sure that as the market continues to get more aggressive and mature, there's probably even more products and services and variations on those. So I have another question here. This is kind of addressed to all three of you, but it relates to Mike's point, and this is from Tripp. Tripp makes an interesting observation. He says many users don't understand why apps slow after data migration, and so his question is, how are some of you on the call here making it easier to work with heavy data, by allowing users, for example, to request desktop apps to be virtualized on virtual desktops or other uses of the cloud. So maybe, Mike, I'll throw that your way and then ask Kevin and Lisa to address that.
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, we approach everything from a data-centric point of view. So how you deploy it is less important to us as it is how you get to it. So if you want to deploy desktop apps in a virtual way, we can provide the right kind of platform to do that, and you can deploy it based on how you want to deploy it with the tools at hand. So you can create a self-service module that makes that possible. And then we do everything we can to make sure that we can keep that data where it needs to be to keep the performance up that you want. Because you're right that things can get stale and things can get slow if you grow it and you don't manage it accordingly. So having the tools to enable you to move it dynamically when you spot a problem and be able to address hotspots with that data is important. And those are the kind of things that we can provide at any level of cloud integration that you want to approach.
Appreciate that. Kevin, how about you in regards to the use of heavy volumes of data and making sure apps are performing at your customers' expectations?
Well, I think two things. Number one is it's helpful to establish a baseline up front, and before you move something, identify exactly how well it works, get a sense of the customer satisfaction with it, because one of the things that we've seen is that there's a perception that applications may be slower because they're not on-prem. That's not always true. In many cases, I believe it's not the case at all. The second part is making sure that that infrastructure that you're working with from your cloud provider is optimized for what you're doing. You may find scenarios where if you're having performance bottlenecks, they're easy to troubleshoot, and the cloud provider may already have solutions on tap. They just need to understand that it's happening. So leverage them in helping solve that problem, but make sure you get the metrics up front so you really know that you're not chasing a phantom.
Great. And Lisa, you had mentioned that at some point it looked like you needed actually more virtual servers than you initially anticipated. Was that a function of handling all the data, and what other things did you experience ultimately to iron out the performance kinks?
Part of it was handling data, but most of it was handling authentication. Actually, I was thinking in the question, going back to what was said earlier, it's a little bit about requirements and about perception about what people are expecting. I mentioned that we're looking at moving other systems to the cloud, and we frequently get a system owner that comes to us and says, I need to take my application to the cloud because it's the new buzz term, right? And that's where I must get better things because it's the newest thing. But they have to understand how much data they have, what are the requirements to access, where that data is. Processing is going to happen. Because in some cases, if that processing is happening up in the cloud, then having the data in the cloud makes perfect sense. But if that processing is happening in interaction with another system, which is on-premise, that may not be the best option for that system. And so getting back to what was said earlier, I think nailing down those requirements and making sure you understand what you need to do with that data and how that data needs to interoperate with other systems is critical in figuring out how you do this.
Mm-hmm. So I have another question here regarding kind of the transparency of costs. One of the early conclusions that a lot of agencies ran into was they really didn't know the cost of providing email, or at least their customers didn't know it or appreciate it, and that the exercise of moving to the cloud forced the discipline to say, what is it really costing per account and so forth. I'm just kind of curious, Lisa, in the process of migrating, did you have that experience of seeing sort of a murky sense of cost and then a greater transparency to support that service? And is that helping you now as you look at exploring moving other services to the cloud?
So we're actually somewhat lucky in that the fact that we're under a working capital fund scenario in this agency. So our cost for providing IT services to the rest of the agency are fairly transparent. We've broken them into quite a great level of detail. So we had a pretty good handle on what it did to cost to provide the cost of an email box for the agency. There were a couple things that were lumped together, like in Lotus Notes, that it's both our license there provides for both the applications and for the email boxes. But we figured that out. So for that one particularly, it was pretty easy to figure out what our current costs were. What we didn't estimate properly is what our future costs were, and that goes back to understanding your requirements and the need for an infrastructure, et cetera, that didn't necessarily get calculated in. Going forward, that is our problem, though, as we're moving forward as other systems, is that people generally don't understand their total cost of ownership of their systems is what we're finding. And that has been hard to train our system owners on that piece of that.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, any additional thoughts?
I'll definitely echo what she said. We do not have good estimates on what we really spend for things because we leave out some of those things that we just assume are cost of doing business. Big thing is accounting for the number of hours that you've spent administering those systems that are now going to be hosted in the cloud and figuring out what required tasks are going forward to make sure that you can still account for that.
And Mike, I'll ask you, in your experience, the cloud service providers obviously are wanting to make a profit, and are they making the sort of component costs of moving to the cloud fairly transparent so the customer can make some informed decisions, or are we entering another world where it's sort of costs behind the curtain?
Well, the costs are there. It's finding out what they are and making sure you do your due diligence in your research. I heard Lisa and Kevin both mention that you got to really understand what you're going to be doing and look at creating a good total cost model to understand where you are. But you also have to extrapolate that over time and growth to make sure that things like egress fees and firewall fees, the things that we don't necessarily think about, are included in whatever model you put forward. And it also needs to include the administration that you're going to do. Yeah, there are some components of administration that you will no longer have to provide when you go to a public cloud provider. But there are still many tasks that you're going to have to do. You won't necessarily reduce your staff by moving to the cloud. So you have to take that into account as well when you do your cost modeling. And that's why we provide all three types of access to data in the cloud so that you can choose what is best for you.
And Mike, a related question. So one of the early fears was that once you moved your data into the cloud, it was likely to be very difficult to move it back out again, even though there was much discussion about portability and so forth, and the importance of service level agreements that allow you to do that. And so the model you described and the seemingly easy way of moving from one provider to another, depending on cost advantages. In your experience, are you finding that it is getting easier and simpler if you want to move your data from one service provider to another, that the obstacles of getting out are not as high as it was once perceived?
I would not say that's the case. If your data lives in the cloud and you're using it on whatever storage the cloud provider is giving you, it's not necessarily easy to get it out. There will be a migration effort. What we provide is tools that make it easier so that if you start your journey and you're a current NetApp customer, go ahead and deploy it with OnTap, because now all you have to do is a snap mirror and your data is now outside of the cloud and you can just start working with it wherever it sits. But if you do happen to put your data into they're not necessarily proprietary, but if you put it into the cloud format that's there, a migration effort will have to occur to get that data out based on what you're doing with it. If it's as simple as a file share, it's a copy. If it's a little bit more complicated than that, then you have to look at what you're doing with it and model it accordingly. So it's not necessarily easier, but there are tools to make it easier if you put some forethought into it.
Great. And we're really coming down to our last couple minutes, and I just wanted to briefly touch on your impressions on the evolution of FedRAMP. Is it helping advance the speed of implementation in overcoming some of the security questions, or is it still a work in progress? Maybe Kevin, I'll ask you, and then we'll jump to Lisa.
I would say that it is definitely a work in progress, but I will tell you that we're a lot better off than we were just a short time ago.
And how about you, Lisa?
Exactly. I'm sorry I giggled as I was speaking, but exactly. It is very much a work in progress still, but it's definitely a forward progress.
Well, that's good. And Mike, any last thought on that?
I giggled too, but it is a work in progress, but it's a necessary thing that we have to go through. So all of the different security aspects of it have to be taken into account.
Well, one would imagine that with oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say one would imagine that without it, we might have taken even longer to get to where we are. So, well, terrific. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it on that note. So Lisa Hearns at EPA and Mike Dye at NetApp and Kevin Baker at FCC, I want to thank you all for sharing some of the essential lessons that you and your organization have learned. I learned a lot today, and really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. And I also want to thank our audience once again for tuning in to FedScoop's Government Technology Webinar Series and acknowledge our sponsor, NetApp, and Avnet, one of their partners, for sponsoring today's program. Just a reminder, our program today will be available on demand within approximately the next 24 hours or so, and will be available for about 90 days time frame. You can access it and download a PDF copy of the slides from the resource list on the console using the same audience link that was emailed to our viewers and visitors today. And again, I would encourage you, please invite your colleagues. There's some great material in the slides. I think they would benefit, and if they tune into the show, they'll get the full value of both the slides and the commentary as if they were tuning in live. And best of all, it's free. So look for more of our coverage on the cloud and government IT technology at work in government on FedScoop.com and our other sites. And with that, on behalf of FedScoop, I want to thank everyone for joining. And this is your host and moderator, Wyatt Cash at FedScoop. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.